I plan to tell you a little bit about us, a publicly listed company in Stockholm, $700 million in market cap, good cash position, and we're in the middle of phase 3 in myeloma. So I will tell a little bit about our view of the myeloma market, where the needs are, still a horrible hematological malignancy for the patients, as well as, of course, our lead asset and what we think we bring to the table to better the treatment outcomes for these patients. First, the normal disclaimer that I'm not responsible for anything I'm saying here today, and then about us. So what we sit on is a proprietary platform where we peptide conjugate actually old school chemotherapeutic compounds. And by peptide conjugate them, we get the construct that is very similar to an antibody drug conjugate, in that we get more of the chemotherapeutic compound into cancer cells and less of it into cells where we don't want it to be. So we have expanded the therapeutic index of basically a basic modality that we know is efficacious, for example, in myeloma. Myeloma is only the first indication, but this platform is, of course, very active across various indications. Our lead compound is called melflufen, and it's a peptide conjugated alkylating agent. And we are having an extensive program in myeloma where we currently have 4 clinical programs ongoing, and then we're adding 1 more myeloma program and then 1 in light chain amyloidosis this autumn. Phase 3 should be fully enrolled this summer, which is a pivotal trial under the special protocol assessment process with the FDA, where we run a head-to-head superiority trial against Celgene's product pomalidomide. We also have 3 additional supporting trials, of which 1 enables the potential to file for accelerated approval, and I'll come back to that. We're listed on Nasdaq Stockholm, the main market, $700 million in market cap, roughly $100 million in cash position and cash equivalents. And this is, of course, not our only molecule. We also have 1 more entity actually that is ready for the clinic this autumn, and then other compounds in preclinical development from the same platform. 2018 was a very active year for us. We raised roughly $38 million in March. We expanded the clinical footprint in our pivotal trial OCEAN to now run at 150 clinics across the US, Western Europe, Korea, and Taiwan. We reported data from Horizon, which is a study in patients without remaining treatment options in myeloma, both at the EHA meeting in Europe in June, as well as at ASH in December, with very good results. We initiated and later reported data from ANCHOR, where we combine our drug together with daratumumab and bortezomib, and we actually showed data that surprised a lot of treating physicians because very strong data was reported at ASH, albeit in small patient numbers at that time. That patient number footprint will be vastly expanded at EHA now in June. And then we did a capital raise now of $55 million roughly in January, just after JP Morgan. I won't bore you with the cost details, but there's nothing unexpected here. I would think as you as investors, you would be surprised at the low cost given the amount of patients and hospitals we are running the company at. So this is our current and ongoing clinical trial program footprint. In Horizon, we look at patients, it's a single-arm trial, up to 150 patients looking at myeloma patients without remaining treatment options. And sometimes that's a bit tricky to define. The FDA have a very clear definition that you need to be triple-class refractory, but some patients are also in the eyes of the physicians at the end of the line, and they are also allowed into this trial. But of course, for regulatory purposes, we will only talk with the agency around the triple-class refractory group. In OCEAN, it's a 450-patient trial, which is a head-to-head superiority trial against pomalidomide, which is a $2 billion drug and growing with Celgene. And we clearly, of course, run that trial because we think we are superior to pomalidomide. In ANCHOR, it's a phase 1/2 trial where we combine with daratumumab and bortezomib to show that this drug is possible to combine. And then in BRIDGE, we show that we work in renally impaired patients. And I'm going to come back to that, but comorbidities is a real limitation for patients with myeloma, where peripheral neuropathy, renal impairment, and cardiovascular disease really limits the amount of drugs you can use and which doses you can use them at. We have no limitations with melflufen with regard to comorbidities, and that is one of the main drivers behind single agent use in myeloma. So what about myeloma? A lot of people say that this is a crowded space. I just want to say that we only have 4 treatment modalities in myeloma. We use alkylators in conjunction with bone marrow transplant. We use anti-CD38, i.e. daratumumab from J&J. We use proteasome inhibition and immunomodulators. For a patient that is fit, we blow 3 of these modalities already in the first line of treatment. The patient is at the minimum refractory to one, most of the time intolerant to another, already in second line. And then we have daratumumab left, that then is used mostly, the biggest combination is with pomalidomide, but very often also as a single agent already in second line. And I'm saying this because it means that the third line patient in myeloma is more or less out of treatment options for the most part, and this is something that people miss. We do not share resistance mechanism with any of these, and that is why we think we have a very strong case for being the drug of choice after PI and IMiD failure, with or without daratumumab on top, and that is what is reflected in our clinical trial development program. Needless to say, myeloma is a huge market. It's a $14 billion market, and it's projected to grow to 27. So the question is not really if this is a big market or not. The question is, do we have a role to play here that is relevant for the patients? And of course, we believe so. Just to show how terrible the prognoses are for these patients, this data looks more or less the same in the European Union and the US. We lose 85% of patients between first and fourth line. Together with myelodysplastic syndrome and ALL in adults, this is one of the worst indications or diagnosis you can get as an adult patient receiving a cancer diagnosis. And this attrition is something that people miss when they say that this is a crowded space and there are a lot of treatment options. I think as a patient, there are not enough treatment options here. One aspect of this that is also missed is that, of course, since this is mostly an elderly population, you would normally have a decline due to age. People die from age, and that is good. That is how it should be. But in myeloma, of course, the curve is much, much more aggressive. Now, this means that the real medical need in myeloma is actually patients that we lose due to this disease way before they should have died from age. And now when we improve care in myeloma, for example, with daratumumab, what happens is that this curve slowly grows upwards. And the result of this is actually that every new drug in myeloma that has been launched has expanded the patient pool, because more patients survive longer and they are in need of treatment. So if you look at the growth numbers, myeloma in itself, if you look at first line here, grows by less than 1%. Which basically means we are getting older as a population, so we have a slight growth of incidence. But if you look at later lines, you have a 25% CAGR in the number of patients treated per year in fourth line plus. And this is of course due to introduction of new drugs, where we desperately try to control the disease. We can't do it, but we actually better the outcome slowly. But this doesn't take away patients from the pool, it expands the pool. We have seen this in multiple other indications where the attrition curve is really horrible, that each new drug actually doesn't take away any patients from any existing drug, it just adds patients that can be treated because they survive longer. So what we do with our drug is that, as I said, it was a peptide alkylating agent, is that it's highly lipophilic. So during the 30-minute infusion that is given once monthly, it freely traverses the cell membrane. At this stage, of course, it doesn't discriminate between a cancer cell and a normal cell. Inside the cell, the peptide gets cleaved off, and it leaves the hydrophilic payload inside the cell. So at the end of an infusion, you actually have an amount of payload in the cell that is proportional to the aminopeptidase activity. And the serendipitous find that we have is that aminopeptidases are massively overexpressed in transformed tissue. So we get between 50 and 100 times more of the payload inside the cell, in the cancer cell, compared to the chemotherapeutic agent alone. And in this sense, the peptide conjugation is very similar to an antibody drug conjugate in that most antibody-drug conjugates, or the majority of them, are tubulin inhibitors. And by conjugating them to an antibody, you get a different microdistribution. You get more of the tubulin inhibitor in some spots and less in others. And you get a completely new drug class that we call antibody-drug conjugates from this. The peptide conjugation works very similarly. We get the payload more in some places and less in others. So we change the microdistribution footprint through this conjugation process, which very much creates a very similar new drug class as the antibody-drug conjugates, but it's peptide conjugated instead. When we went out and created this drug, we thought that we would have higher efficacy, better safety, and that's exactly what we have seen in the clinic. This drug has basically no non-hematological, non-infectious based toxicity in patients, and most patients feel relatively well on treatment. We don't have a single patient with hair loss, despite the fact being intravenous chemo, very little fatigue and nausea, no mucositis. It is basically hematologic suppression. And this is worth mentioning more than once. You don't feel hematologic suppression. If you were to sit here today with thrombocytes of 20 or 30, you wouldn't feel any difference. The only thing that you would feel is if you were to get a bleeding event from the thrombocytopenia, or if you were to, from the neutropenia, get an infection. We have no bleedings, and we have a very low, comparatively speaking with other drugs in myeloma, infection rate. So while the treating physician are looking at myelosuppression to say, should I dose the next time, should I dose reduce, it's mostly lab values going up and down that your treating physician are looking at, while you as a patient, you don't feel that. And this is very different from a lot of safety effects that other drugs are having. And finally, I think some people find us a little bit boring because, to be frank, because it's just enhanced chemotherapy. I think anyone that has had a relative on chemo knows that the biggest problem is the lack of efficacy and the high levels of toxicity. So this is really something that is important in the clinic. What does it take to succeed in myeloma? Well, this is a very simple list. You need a drug with single agent activity above 20% response rate in multi-refractory patients. You need approval as a single agent because hematologists love to pick and mix. So you want a single agent approval with or without steroid. You need to show that you have efficacy synergies with other drugs, once again because hematologists like to pick and mix, and based on the comorbidities and the refractory profile of the patient, they need to be able to combine rather freely. You can have no major quality of life or tolerability issues. This is a palliative care setting, and the patients know that their time is limited, and you don't want to spend that suffering too much from toxicities. These patients suffer from a lot of comorbidities, peripheral neuropathy, cardiovascular and renal impairment, and you cannot have any major limitations there because they really stack up in later lines. And you need to have an easy administration schedule. It sounds like a very small thing, but if administration schedules are complicated, it really impairs the ability of clinicians to give the appropriate care. It's a bottleneck at most clinics, infusion centers. And if you actually sort of stratify according to these criteria, of recently approved drugs in myeloma, so this excludes Velcade, Melphalan, and Revlimid, only Pomalyst and Darzalex actually checks all these boxes. And they are also by far the highest selling drugs of these ones. Kyprolis and Feradac have various limitations. Worth mentioning is Feradac that has pretty bad gastrointestinal toxicity despite being approved. It's not used. It's not used. You don't want to spend your last months in the bathroom. Limited to, and then you have Ninlaro and Impliciti. They have limited to no single agent data, so you can't combine it freely. It really limits the amount of patients that are applicable for the care. And I think a lot of analysts, to be frank, have missed this with Impliciti. Despite showing good efficacy, the limitations of being able to combine it really drags down the use for practical use at the clinic. So how do we stack up? Well, we have showed more than 30% response rates in multi-refractory patients in 2 clinical trials. The whole clinical development program is designed to give single agent approval, to give exactly the type of label that enables you to tap into this marketplace. We showed data from Anchor, our combination study, at ASH now in December. That was actually basically, we showed 86 and 100% response rate in multi-refractory patients in combination with excellent tolerability profile. When it comes to quality of life, the lack of non-hematologic toxicity is really good for the patients. We heard early on from study nurses that our patients didn't call during the weekend, and we have continued to hear that, and that's a really good sign. And I think most physicians that have used this drug wants to use it again. Most physicians that haven't heard about the drug, they think it's just another alkylating agent and sort of dismiss it. And I think that's a good sign. People that use it want to use it more. We have no comorbidity limitations. And once again, in later lines, the comorbidities stack up. So this is a key point to actually address these patients and the needs of these patients. And the administration schedule, it's a once monthly 30-minute infusion. Very easy for the clinic, very easy for the patient, and it fits the infusion centers very, very well. So who is our patient? Our patient is a patient that has failed on proteasome inhibitor and immunomodulator therapy. And as I said early on, most patients get these in combination already in the first line. So how do we define the word failure? Well, luckily enough, these are defined in guidelines. If you have a relapse less than 2 years after you have received the drug, you should switch class. That's in the guideline documents. And if you look here at the number of patients that are with less than 2 years since their last drug, it is actually the majority after first line. The vast majority of patients, it's just a tail of patients that gets 2 year plus between a line of therapy and their next relapse, when you actually can use the same drugs over and over again. And this means that we are fundamentally addressing a significant need in the relapsed refractory myeloma market, which is $8 billion out of the 14. So actually it's the biggest myeloma market, but of course first line $6 billion is a significant piece here. And since we are running a head-to-head against pomalidomide from Celgene, I think the pomalidomide sales numbers are relevant. And this is actually 2017 numbers. They are more than $2 billion today. Still a growing drug. So going back to our trial program again, my idea is just to briefly go through some data from our trials, and I'm going to take them in order. But if we start with Horizon, we're going to start with O12M1, which is our old phase 2 data. And just this triggered us to go public. It's a lot of data on these slides, but please note that these trials are in the same patient populations, and here we compare us with daratumumab, pomalidomide, and carfilzomib. And in this single-arm trial, our data really stood out. It's actually, now, one should be very careful with cross-study comparisons, but especially the survival data is astonishingly good at 21 months. And now when we have done even longer follow-up on these patients, actually 40% of the patients from this study, they just don't die, which is great. And we seem to be doing something profoundly positive for these patients. But we are at the top of the chart in terms of both response rates, PFS, and OS, which is a very good thing. Obviously, cross-study comparison, one needs to be careful. We need more data. We need randomized data. At ASH then, we presented Paul Richardson here from Harvard. Professor Richardson presented our Horizon data set in patients without remaining treatment options, which created a lot of buzz. So these are the patients that are to some extent called triple-class refractory patients. That is, you're refractory both to immunomodulators, proteasome inhibitors, and anti-CD38 therapy. And it was very well received. And the reason was, of course, that we showed a 33% response rate with a median PFS of 4 months in a very, very ill population, actually, where more than 60% of the patients had what is called extramedullary relapse. That is that you actually get the metastatic myeloma disease in conjunction with the relapse, which is a very bad prognostic factor. Several of the patients had CNS infiltration of their myeloma disease, which is something we never saw a few years ago, but now is happening now as we keep the patients longer, which is a very bad prognostic sign. I can't say that we had a great efficacy in those patients, but we wanted to see if we could do something because it's a horrible end-stage myeloma patient. state for the patient. As you also can see, which is worth noting, is that out of our responding patients, actually a third of them achieved what is called VGPR or CRs, which is a really deep response, which is very meaningful for the patient. The other aspect, and this is a very technical graph, is the absence of non-hematologic toxicity. So in this very ill patient population, we had a serious adverse event rate of 37%, which is a very good number if you compare to other people having done studies in this population. And yes, we have hematological suppression. These numbers are not surprisingly big. You would find roughly the same numbers with pomalidomide or, for example, Karyopharm, selinexor, etc., because the disease in itself causes myelosuppression. And then you have a bit of infections, and 5% is not a bad number at all. It's actually a good number. But then the table ends, and it's not because I haven't put it here. We don't have anything outside of infections and hematologic disorders in more than 5% of patients of any serious grade. And if you look at the FDA documents for various compounds, this is normally how the FDA would schedule it, with having grade 3, grade 4 treatment emergent adverse events in more than 5% of patients. It's exactly how they would put it up, so you can easily compare. And this just highlights the very good tolerability profile of this drug. Only 25% of patients in this patient group needed to dose reduce. The rest could maintain the right dose, which was the starting dose in this study. We felt very strengthened by the ODAC meeting that Karyopharm, a competing company, had with their agent selinexor, because the FDA more or less confirmed the level of efficacy and the patient population that they could consider for accelerated approval. And they were very focused on the toxicity profile of the compound, and that's an area where we shine. So we're going to talk to the FDA in the second quarter this year, and we're going to have the full patient number required to potentially file for accelerated approval this summer. We're going to see, of course, how the remaining patients that we recruit to OCEAN perform and what the FDA says, but we feel very good about our data set. We also at ASH showed very encouraging data from our combinations with bortezomib and daratumumab. And the small patient numbers with bortezomib, we only had 3 patients. All of them, none of the patients had ever achieved a complete response or anything similar in their past. As you can see, the median age here was 81. This is a very old patient population that is fairly frail. They have started to become refractory, which is a bad sign. And still at this stage, we had a partial response in all 3 patients, and at 6 months timeline, they were still ongoing. 2 patients had gone 6 months, and the responses were still seen as deepening, and it has continued since December. All patients are still ongoing. We have much more patients today, of course, than we presented at ASH as well. In combination with daratumumab, we had 9 patients, and we had a response rate of 86%. 1 patient didn't respond, and we only had 1 month follow-up data on that patient. But all of the other patients, they had responses that also became deeper and deeper over time. All patients remained on treatment after 6 months or more, and it was a very encouraging data set with, once again, basically no non-hematologic toxicity, very good tolerability profile, with almost immediate bone pain relief in the first cycle of all these patients. So this is what triggered us to raise additional capital now in January, because we're going to do a second pivotal trial where we do melflufen, daratumumab, dexamethasone versus daratumumab, dexamethasone as a combination trial as well, to even further de-risk the clinical development program. OCEAN, our superiority trial against pomalidomide, is a 450-patient trial, randomized 1-to-1, so 225 patients in each arm, and it plans to be fully recruited this summer. And this is a highly relevant trial, both from a clinical point of view and a regulatory point of view. And some people will tell you that, yeah, but pomalidomide is always used in combination. In reality, most patients are only receiving pomalidomide plus dexamethasone in the clinical setting, but not at academic centers. There they all get combinations. But actually in clinical practice, if you go out to community-based hospitals, they get just Pomdex. But of course, it is also a relevant trial because it's a real clinical comparison. Pomdex, that is a part of standard of care, the biggest drug in relapsed refractory myeloma, versus melflufen dex. Why do we believe that we can beat POM? The reason is that pomalidomide share resistance mechanism with the biggest drug in myeloma, which is Revlimid. And in this trial that is under special protocol assessment with the FDA, all patients are recent Revlimid failures. And this is not to try to create a very favorable position for us. This is because how POM is used. POM is used almost straight after Revlimid failure in the clinical setting, or very close to Revlimid failure. And POM has much more cross-resistance to Revlimid than what people think. And this was shown first by Tanos Dimopoulos, who was the main author of the Revlimid registration package once upon a time, that showed, and it's a complicated chart, but in essence, if you have recently failed on Revlimid, pomalidomide loses half of its efficacy. So you see 50% reduction in pomalidomide efficacy in a recent Revlimid failed patient compared to someone that failed Revlimid a long time ago. So our point is not that pomalidomide is a bad drug, it's just that you need an image-free period. What should you use after Revlimid failure? Well, and we say you should use melflufen, and then you can use pomalidomide afterwards. And that is what we're trying to prove in our trial. I said that we have last patient in this summer. We had slower recruitment last year than we hoped. We added a lot of hospitals, and recruitment has been great early this year, so we have stayed with the target of last patient in this summer. Maybe there is a slight delay. We're going to give a recruitment update in a month or so, but it's not like we are totally off course here. So, but we want to give clear guidance to the market exactly when we expect the last patient in here. As I said, we are planning also the combination trial with is that we call Lighthouse, which is melflufen daratumumab dex versus Daradex. Very important trial for us to really capture the combination market on top of everything else. And that gives us actually 3 shots on goal. We have Horizon for accelerated approval, Ocean under SPA for superiority over pomalidomide, and a combination trial. This trial will start second half of this year, and we plan to have a 12-month recruitment period. So the data shouldn't come too late for this one either. We also initiate, together with Professor Merlini in Milano, a new indication, light chain amyloidosis. It's actually B-cell tumor as well, sort of, but the biggest problem is that you deposit light chains from your antibodies. So they precipitate very similar to an Alzheimer's disease. It's a deposit disease with a horrible prognosis. Since the antibodies are in the blood, the deposits end up in organs which have a high perfusion rate. So normally liver, heart, lungs, CNS, and the heart is the most common organ actually where you get multiple deposits, and heart failure is the most common cause of death because they form like stalactites inside the organs. Most drugs that are efficacious in myeloma can help these patients, and we hope to have a good efficacy signal, but obviously we don't know that yet. This trial will start second half of this year as well. So the news flow. In first half of this year, we have a very rich news flow where we show data from both Anchor and Horizon at AACR. We show updated data from Anchor and Horizon at the European Hematology Association meeting early June. We're going to give guidance on last patient in Ocean, and we're going to publish our old O12-M1 study. And here actually it's very important to note the survival data that just has improved, which will include all the updated survival data in that trial. We're going to have last patient in Ocean somewhere around the summertime. We'll see exactly when that happens. And then we're going to have the first patient in the amyloidosis trial in the second half. We're going to have top-line results from our pivotal trial, Ocean. We're going to have a first patient in Lighthouse, our second pivotal trial. And then, of course, we're going to have an update from all our clinical studies at ASH in December. If the FDA meeting results in a positive message from the FDA regarding the Horizon trial and the chance for accelerated approval, we will need to comment on that end of Q2. And of course, if we actually choose to file, hence that we commit to file on Horizon, we will need to communicate that as well. throughout this period. Thank you very much for letting me present, and if you have any questions, I think the Q&A session will be, John?
University room.
The Boston University room, just down the hall. Thank you very much.